Well, at long last, we have this part of this series. Oh dear, my upload schedule really is a meme. Anyway, I'm using a new controller layout. As you can see, it is red. Let me know what you think of it. Let's get started. This Thrasher is a pickup truck going from 0 to 60 in 4.4 seconds. It's the only other truck in the game, and it's probably the better of the two. It's very fast off the line, and it only weighs in at 1,649 kilos. I say only, it's actually fairly heavy. It makes 272 brake horsepower and 410 Nm of torque, giving it a fairly stout power figure against other cars. I've got to say, I really like this truck. It's strong, fairly fast, and it looks brilliant. In terms of handling, it's what you'd expect. The rear feels very light while cornering, but thanks to Wreckfest game design, the rear isn't actually that light, which would make it very easy to spin. Don't get me wrong though, those big wheel arches can be abused, and despite being a truck, it's actually quite small. This truck was actually buffed a little while ago, and now it is a lot more competitive than it previously was. Overall, I'd put it here on the triangle, and with it I set a 1 minute and 10.474. Not too bad, really. So then, Muddigger. Well, going from 0 to 60 in 4.46 seconds, it weighs in at 2,131 kilos and makes 331 brake horsepower and 655 Nm of torque. Sadly, this isn't enough to make it fast, but you don't really drive the Muddigger because it's fast, do you? You drive it because you can control fights and deal lots of damage. The engine feels underpowered in C-Class. Despite being turbocharged, if you listen to the engine notes, it actually bogs down quite badly and understeers in corners. I digress. The understeer is mainly because it has 4 gears, but that's just kind of part of what the car does. In the career series Redneck Rage under National Amateurs, you can get a cut bed mod which looks awesome for this, and you can also get wider wheels. These improve the handling very slightly, but without some extreme sweat and blood, yeah, most players are going to struggle to keep up. I certainly do. Overall, I put it here on the triangle, and with it I set a pretty poor 1 minute 12.273. I'm going to mention the time split here, because my other 2 laps I did were 1 minute 13 and 1 minute 14, so your mileage may vary. Even the Nexus is a sweet relief from the Muddigger though. Going from 0 to 60 in 4.91 seconds, the Nexus is, well, a typical front-wheel drive car. It's actually the most powerful front-wheel drive in the game, at least at the moment, making an earth-shattering 143 brake horsepower. It weighs in at 867 kilos. It's not going to be winning any power records, that's for sure, but there are upsides to this car. It's probably the easiest front-wheel drive car to drive, so if you actually wanted to learn to drive them, well, I guess it could be a good car to drive. I find the gear ratios on this car are kind of annoying. It doesn't really have enough power or torque to efficiently utilise the entirety of the power band, and because of the way your gearing options are set up, I find that I'm either shifting too much and so I can't use all of the engine power, or I'm shifting not often enough and I drop out of the power band. Thanks to its relatively long body, the car's actually fairly agile, but overall I'd put it here on the triangle, and with it I set a 1 minute and 10.545, which actually is a decent bit better than I thought. Here we have the Outlaw. Boasting 6 gears and extremely stiff suspension, it goes from 0 to 60 in 4.72 seconds. The Outlaw is a strange combination of annoying understeer and then sudden oversteer, which makes the car very unpredictable to drive. I do kind of like the fact that it's so unpredictable. It kind of makes it a very, how can we word it politely? Unique experience. Its acceleration is good in almost any gear though, and weighing in at only 1,018 kilos, it makes 167 brake horsepower and 159 Nm of torque, so it does have the potential to pull. It's kind of a shame this car isn't any better than it is, and it is quite weak, but I'm sure with some more practice I could probably do a lot better than I have done here in it. Overall I put it around here on the triangle, and with it I set a 1 minute and 12.598. The Outlaw is part of the Backwoods Bangers car pack. Here we have the Hunter Panther. No, the Panther RS. This is usually a base game player's first encounter with a 6-gear car. Going from 0 to 60 if you don't miss a gear in 4.55 seconds, it's quite slow off the line for what it appears to be. That doesn't make it a slouch by any means though. Making 295 brake horsepower and 381 Nm of torque, it weighs in at over 1700 kilos with any armour on. Now, in my opinion, this car has one of the best gearing setups in the game, and the Hunter Panther, as we covered in the last part, copies it, making that a very competitive car. However, this is just the Panther RS, and the handling is, well, kind of muted and soft feeling owing to that weight, making turns, while typically a bit slow, very easy and very predictable. Combining that with the epic gears this car has, makes it a very easy car to drive as a newer player. I would highly suggest using this if you want to learn clutch manual, as you're going to be shifting a lot with 6 gears, and it's really easy to stay in the power band. Also, with very little armour on, this car becomes quite a good fighter, comparable to something like the Roadslayer or a lighter setup Warwagon. Overall, I'd put it here on the triangle, and with it I set a kind of disappointing 1 minute 11.076. Next we have the first car 3/4 view skip to, and I'm going to have to talk quickly for this. Raiden RS. As of time of writing, this is the most competitive car in the game, holding 25A, 69B, 59C and 80D class first place leaderboard entries. Going from 0 to 60 in 4.38 seconds, it makes 142 brake horsepower and 191 Nm of torque. Weighing in at only 864 kilos, it sounds slightly underpowered. Well, this car's so fast because of its uncanny grip. Thanks to it being very wide and short, it's also extremely agile. Be careful using the handbrake in this car, as it will very easily and willingly snap sideways, which it should do while cornering normally. Regardless, there isn't that much to say about this car really. It's the best car in the game, and it grips everywhere. The nose points perfectly at will, and with very little practice, any player can be easily getting top 10 regular positions in online races. I actually struggle with the Raiden a little bit, because I set my steering sensitivity to be a decent bit higher than normal. It makes the car very skittish to drive for me. Overall, I put it here on the triangle, and with it I set a 1 minute and 9.251. I'm actually a bit disappointed with this time. There's a lot more for this car to give, but I'm not doing more than 3 laps per car. Raiden is part of the Rusty Rats car pack. Managed to get it all in, damn, nice. Here we have Rammer. This car is very disappointing to me, kind of. Going from 0 to 60 in 4.4 seconds, it makes 292 brake horsepower and 447 Nm of torque. Mine, with this armour, weighs in at 1773 kilos. Now, this car isn't really that fast, let's get that understood first. Very soft suspension makes this car feel kind of like a boat, hence why I run armour on it. This car, like its name suggests, is, well, an excellent fighting vehicle. It doesn't get much slower when you add armour on either, so you can set up a very competitive car. And for that, I really do like it. I've driven this car a lot in Server 3 and similar servers, so I'm very familiar with it. The rear steps out smoothly and can easily have its angles changed. Combined with only having 4 gears, you can focus on fighting over banging perfect gear shifts. The gearing is a little bit awkward though, but overall I put it here on the triangle, and with it I set a surprising 1 minute and 9.984. I guess Raiden must have sped me up a bit. Rammer RS is, well, the RS version of the Rammer. Going from 0 to 60 in 4.4 seconds, it is just a more taut and tight version of its standard counterpart. With this armour on, it weighs in at 1973 kilos, makes 325 brake horsepower and 293 Nm of torque. Now this car's a decent bit slower than its standard counterpart, on dirt exclusively. On tarmac, it's significantly grippier and faster in, well, literally every way. Its handling is very similar to that of the Rammer, just with less sway and being more taut. I can't really describe it without describing the Rammer again, so sorry I guess. Overall I put it here on the triangle, and with it I set a 1 minute and 10.646. Remember I said it was slower on dirt? Well, I tested it again on Espedal and Main, and set a 1 minute and 7.1 from a standing start in this, and with the Rammer I did a 1 minute and 8.5. In order to unlock this car, you must have the Rammer first, and perform the Ramming It Down Demolition Racing Challenge in National Amateurs. The Raven is a very unique car, going from 0 to 60 in 4.54 seconds and weighing in at 1,650 kilos. It makes 272 brake horsepower, 532 Newton meters of torque. The Raven has the ability to pull in every single gear almost, regardless of tuning, except 4th gear, which is an overdrive gear. I hate overdrive. This is thankfully one of only 2 cars in the game that has an overdrive gear. That being said, if this car had a regular 4th gear, it would be possibly one of the fastest cars in the game. As it is, it's still very competitive in C-Class, even holding a few records in D-Class. The Raven feels very tight to use. The suspension on 4, I find it makes the almost constant grunt granted by this car's very torquey engine, lets it get power down incredibly well. 4th gear should probably be avoided at all costs, to such an extent that I actually run 4 gearing, so that I can shift into 4th around 108 miles an hour. It's often faster to rag this car all the way to the limiter in 3rd than shift into 4th. Overall, I put it here on the triangle, and with it I set a 1 minute and 9.378. Raven is part of the Racing Heroes car pack. The Razor is one of, if not the stiffest car in Wreckfest. Weighing 1,590 kilos, the Razor makes 263 brake horsepower and 350 Newton meters of torque. Going from 0 to 60 in 4.41 seconds, this car is very popular in dirty servers, purely because of how fast it can be with armour on. This car is an extremely capable fighting car with very predictable drifting on tarmac and, well, incredibly quick acceleration. However, the suspension in this car has very stiff compression. By this, all I mean is that the suspension in its first bit of travel is extremely stiff. Even while the suspension is set to being very soft, you can notice this. Sudden bumps in the road can throw the car around very easily, and with the suspension set as hard as possible, you may not even be able to steer effectively as the tyres simply bounce off the road. On tarmac, this car has potentially some of the best handling characteristics in the game, being able to slide perfectly with great predictability, even if it is a little bit slow to drift like that. Overall, I'd put it here on the triangle, and with it I set a 1 minute and 9.078. This is a really good example of a car that is equally balanced and pulled off well. Razor is part of the Getaway car pack. RebelRat is a strange car. Going from 0 to 60 in 4.42 seconds, it's quite quick off the line. Weighing in at 1,490 kilos, it makes 245 brake horsepower and 449 Newton meters of torque. Much like Eagle R, this car has a wider rear than front, meaning it will suddenly snap oversteer, but the front easily has enough grip to keep the rear in check. This does make it easier to spin than most cars though, but that isn't too much of an issue. Sporting the largest wing in the game, this car is kind of flashy, and its torque allows it to accelerate very quickly. Sadly, its grip in corners leaves a lot to be desired, and because of its weird upgrades, it can only be at 163 in C-Class without armour on. This doesn't really matter too much, but its next engine is far better for upgrade options if you want to run armour. I would recommend running armour too, specifically on the front, because this car feels quite weak to me, with a tougher gearbox and engine but weaker suspension, brakes and wheels. Overall, I'd put it here on the triangle, and with it I set a 1 minute and 9.918. This car is part of the Rusty Rats car pack. Roadcutter is weird. Going from 0 to 60 in 4.39 seconds, it's extremely fast off the line, making 272 brake horsepower and 420 Newton meters of torque. It weighs in at 1,650 kilos. Where to begin? This car has something going on with its suspension. I don't really know how to describe it, but basically the suspension seems to load up on cambers, which then makes it extremely fast when you come out of those corners, giving it some top lap times on tracks like Hellride. On normal circuits, this isn't really so much of a factor though. You can still notice it a little bit. Regardless of that, with lots of armour on, this car can cause some incredible chaos out of turns on tracks like Hellride and Deathloop, carrying significantly more speed than most, if not all other cars. Its handling otherwise is just typical muscle car behaviour, bogging down too much into oversteer in a higher gear, but being very predictable otherwise. I find that I struggle to use the power band efficiently in this car, probably down to a lack of practice in it, but overall though, I'd put it here on the triangle, and with it I set a 1 minute and 10.050. Roadslayer used to be one of the go-to meta cars before things like Raiden came out. Going from 0 to 60 in 4.32 seconds, this is, ignoring tournament cars, probably the fastest base game car there is. Weighing in at 1,482 kilos, it makes 242 brake horsepower and 469 Nm of torque. Roadslayer is a great example of pure power, being able to keep up with and out-accelerate all but the fastest cars in the game, in fact arguably all but the Super Venom. Its handling feels slightly sluggish into turns, but when the Roadslayer begins to oversteer it's very predictable and smooth, making cornering quite fast. In every class, this car is stout and competitive, keeping some top 100 times to this day. The only thing it suffers from is gearing for C-Class. It can also only be upgraded to 163 without any armour, but maxing out at 108 miles an hour will mean that you're going to top out on some of the fastest straights. Now, you could make an argument for this being the best car in Wreckfest, not from a lap time point of view, but just in general. With armour, like the Razor, this car doesn't really get much slower, but it does have the acceleration to catch up with players, so if you struggle with cornering, you've just got the power. Overall, I'd put it here on the triangle, and with it I set a 1 minute and 9.197. Roadslayer GT is a good example of getting 6-geared cars wrong. Going from 0 to 60 in 4.54 seconds, Roadslayer GT weighs in at 1,873 kilos and makes 309 brake horsepower and 435 Nm of torque. So what went wrong with Roadslayer GT? Its handling is pretty much identical to that of the Roadslayers, and so surely just having 6 gears means you can spend more time in the power band? Well, Roadslayer GT has a different engine to Roadslayer. Roadslayer GT's red line is around 6,700 RPM compared to 4,800 of the Roadslayer. The Roadslayer is good because of the insane torque that the engine makes, but the Roadslayer GT does not have that torque, so you need grip and agility to get that power down, but you still retain that Roadslayer handling, which isn't very agile at all. The grip's okay, but when you've not got that power behind the engine to use that grip and force agility, on a big car like this, it just feels very underwhelming. Overall, I put this car here on the triangle, and with it I set a 1 minute and 9.461. Not that much worse than the Roadslayer until you realise that you have to complete the challenge slaying the road in World Champions, driving the standard Roadslayer to unlock this worse counterpart. We all know the Rocket, it's the first car we all drove. Very nostalgic, hey? This is actually arguably one of the best cars, well, most perfectly balanced cars in the game. Going from 0 to 60 in 4.69 seconds, Rocket makes 215 brake horsepower and 393 Nm of torque. Rocket's a relatively tough car for what it is, and it doesn't really stand out in any one aspect. What this car really gives players is a chance to see what they prefer in a car. Typically a player will go from this to the Tristar to the Killer Bee. Now when you compare the Rocket to those two, it has a lot of grunt. It's certainly the powerhouse of the three, being very easy and predictable to drive, and actually almost impossible to spin yourself out in it. This gives players a taste of a powerful car without the poor grip of the Venom or the mediocre agility of the Roadslayer. There really is no downside to this car aside from the fact that, well, it doesn't really do anything particularly well. I think this car gets a bit of a bad rep for being a noob's car, because it's the first car we all drive, and so people think it's actually bad, but it's not that bad at all. Overall, I put it here on the triangle, and with it I set a middle of the road 1 minute and 10.026. Rocket RX is an all-round upgrade to the Rocket, getting an extra gear as well. Rocket RX goes from 0 to 60 in 4.58 seconds, weighing in at 1,360 kilos. It makes 225 brake horsepower and 297 Nm of torque. This car sparked a little bit of controversy when it first came out. Costing nearly double that of the Super Venom, its handling was fairly similar, but unlike the Super Venom, it didn't have obscene acceleration. Instead, it was a slidey, drifting machine. Very slow and very sideways. Well, a little while after that, everyone stopped using it, and the developers decided to upgrade its grip. This meant that it could get the power down more effectively, and of course, corner a lot harder. Its suspension is also noticeably stiffer than the Rocket's, also, making the car feel a lot more snappy when you're trying to change direction after a turn. Honestly, it does feel just like a Rocket with a wide body kit on and, well, an extra gear. Overall, I put it here on the triangle, and in it I set a 1 minute and 9.167, which I'm surprised at how much better it was compared to the Rocket. The Sandstorm is a 4-wheel drive doom buggy, going from 0 to 60 in 4.28 seconds. This is its only good side. Weighing in at 1,398 kilos, it makes 230 brake horsepower and 282 Nm of torque. Where to start with the Sandstorm? Notice first how off the line I was changing gear very quickly. This is down to an extremely small power band of the Sandstorm, being between its two peaks 900 RPM, and it drops off very quickly at both ends as well. Compare that to 2400 of the Rocket or 1800 of the Super Venom, for example. This means that you need one of two things: really long gears to use all of the power band for longer, this will ruin your 0 to 60 time as the car bogs down while you accelerate, or extremely attentive driving, which nobody can be bothered with, me being an exception here. Being a 4-wheel drive car, locking the diff makes the handling rather poor, to put it kindly, sliding everywhere with no worries in the world if you have it locked or not. Thanks to that tiny power band, it's also not too hard to bog down in corners too. The Sandstorm is gigantic for how little it weighs too, and it gets no armour options. Overall I put it here on the triangle, and with it I set a 1 minute 11.222. The developers were scared of making 4-wheel drive cars too overpowered, I think, so they shied away. All the cars from the off-road car pack need attention paying to them. Speedbird is the most expensive base game car you can buy. Going from 0 to 60 in 4.59 seconds, Speedbird makes 259 brake horsepower and 444 Nm of torque. Weighing in at 1,574 kilos, this is a good example of a well-balanced car, sacrificing a little bit of toughness for this. I really like the Speedbird purely because of how it combines a great front-end grip and predictable oversteer. I find that I can point the front of the car anywhere with impunity and it will go. Understeer is, well, practically non-existent for this car, basically everywhere. In fact, I cannot think of a situation where this car does understeer, compared to even something like the Super Venom where you do find understeer in some situations. Honestly, this car's biggest problem is the fact that it's just slightly slow and its short top end, making changing gear while going uphill a very bad choice. Comfortably though, it will make up for that in, well, every other way. Overall I would put it here on the triangle, and with it I set a 1 minute and 10.203. Speedbird GT. Going from 0 to 60 in 4.59 seconds, its acceleration is identical to that of Speedbird's. If you saw my review on the Speedbird GT, you'll know I gave a pretty scathing review on it, partly because it was identical to the Speedbird, but also because we already had a Speedbird skin. Well, in the end, they did buff it after fixing its broken textures. Its power and weight is identical to that of the Speedbird's, and its acceleration is also exactly the same. Like, literally, 0 to 60 times were identical to the 100th of a second. So what did they actually change on this car? Because you're picking between 100,000 fame and I think 10,000 fame for the Speedbird texture. Well, put simply, I don't know. I don't know what got changed. In the patch notes it says that its competitiveness was improved, and it was. It is certainly better. I can only assume its traction coefficient was improved, essentially making the Speedbird GT even more planted and agile than the Speedbird already is. And typically you would lose power from that, but in this you just don't. I did message a developer asking what it was specifically that they changed, but there was no reply. Overall, I put it here on the triangle, and with it I set a 1 minute 9.911. Speedemon kind of fails to live up to its name. Going from 0 to 60 in 4.44 seconds, Speedemon makes 268 brake horsepower and 338 Nm of torque. This car really reminds me of the Rocket in some ways, being a fairly stout, middle-of-the-road car. However, Speedemon gets 6 gears. This means it's able to stay in the power band far more effectively. Combined with a decent bit more grip, I find this car corners excellently, let down by a lack of power out of corners though. Thankfully, having lots of gears means that you can stay in the power band fairly well, and its power band is very, how do I word it, long. The suspension in the Speedemon feels very slushy, and, well, it doesn't really matter what the tuning is for your suspension, it'll always feel like that. It's just kind of a part of the car. You'd think it's actually annoying, but I find that it makes the car quite good if you get caught in a difficult position, and because it won't bounce around on the track like a Razor or Roadslayer, and it can be worked around fairly easily. Overall I put it here on the triangle, and with it I set a 1 minute and 10.162. Speedie is, well, I don't want to say it, it's a good front wheel drive car. Going from 0 to 60 in 5.29 seconds, it weighs in at 599 kilos, makes 115 brake horsepower and 150 Nm of torque. Speedie is one of, if not the slowest accelerating car in the game. It doesn't really need acceleration though. This car has the insane ability to maintain some of the highest cornering speeds that you can do, while maybe the Raiden exclusively, and honestly it's kind of close between those two. So on a track like Sandstorm, this car's obviously at quite a big disadvantage. The handbrake in this car is, well, terrifying to use. It'll snap the car 90 degrees sideways almost instantly, but being front wheel drive you can keep accelerating while handbraking. Doesn't really help that much with the snapping though. Speedie has a surprising lack of understeer too, so you find yourself focusing more on maintaining speed through turns. Being as small and light as it does means that it obviously is going to get bullied on the track, but if you can get inside of a player, you're guaranteed to overtake. Overall I put it here on the triangle, and with it I set a 1 minute 11.577. Speedie is part of the Racing Heroes car pack. Starbeast is kind of a secret weapon. Going from 0 to 60 in 4.5 seconds, it makes 272 brake horsepower and 453 Nm of torque, weighing in at 1,650 kilos. I'm not really sure where to start with this car. I suppose I'll start with the power band. Despite it getting 5 gears, Starbeast's power band is gigantic. This is a theme you'd normally find among 4-gear cars. The front suspension is also something like double the length of the rear suspension, which makes the handling very consistent everywhere. Typically you'd expect understeer while going downhill with suspension like this, but it's not an issue with the stiffest suspension, and because it's so long you can plough through anything with stiff suspension. Starbeast is also fairly tough and quite easy to make it very well armoured, very stealthily. Getting a painted steel beam front bumper, the only place this car's really let down is a lack of gears and sideways grip. What I mean by gears is, if you use shorter gears like I do, you'll find that the car is often at the end of its very long power band, making it quite hard to utilise, but you also lose out on acceleration if you have the gears any longer. Being a higher class would help, but we're doing C class. Overall I put it here on the triangle, and with it I set a 1 minute and 10.443. Starbeast SS is a straight upgrade to the Starbeast, going from 0 to 60 in 4.7 seconds. Wait, I called it an upgrade, but it's slower to 60. Okay, having identical statistics to the Starbeast, the only actual difference between this and the Starbeast is its power band being about 400 RPM higher. After what I said about the Starbeast having an awkward power band though, surely this would be better. Well, no, the engine still tops out at the same place, making the top end of the power band dip off very sharply. Put simply, the car feels like it's got no power at the red line. Despite this, the Starbeast SS has level suspension, unlike its standard counterpart, which makes it more stance through corners. Now, before they buffed it, this meant that it was actually worse in every way except on tarmac, where it was merely as good as the Starbeast. Not really something you want to be spending 70,000 fame on. It was actually 100,000 when it first came out too, but they put that down thankfully, even if it is from the alpha stages of the game. Thankfully this car was buffed. While its power band remains in its annoying state, the car now grips and changes direction far better, making it significantly more agile. Overall I put it here on the triangle, and with it I set a 1 minute and 10.196. Stella sits in a weird place for me. Going from 0 to 60 in 4.8 seconds, it makes 213 brake horsepower and 232 Nm of torque. Weighing in at 1,290 kilos, you might be able to see why I think it's weird. This car isn't very fast in a straight line or particularly agile, and it's not very tough. However, its power band is perfectly balanced, meaning that you're always going to pull in whatever gear, if you shift correctly of course. This car is very challenging to drive, not because it's particularly slow, but because in order to get the most out of it, you really need to pay attention. And when you don't, it kind of loses off very quickly. I think this earns the car a bit of a bad rep, because it's clearly capable when players first try it out, but then they struggle to force it into a playstyle, forgetting that you need to drive with the car and learn how it plays. You can't just push it into a playstyle like you can some of the more meta cars. I lost the best lap clip here, but the driving here kind of demonstrates what I mean. Overall I put it here on the triangle, and with it I set a 1 minute and 10.909. Stella is part of the Racing Heroes car pack. Sunrise Super used to be a favourite of mine, and it's actually one of the most popular cars in the game still, for good reason. Going from 0 to 60 in 4.57 seconds, it makes 162 brake horsepower and 193 Nm of torque. Weighing in at 982 kilos, the Sunrise is an awesome combination of a light and agile car mixed with a fairly long and narrow wheelbase. This gives it arguably some of the best handling characteristics in the game from a car under a ton. It's very grippy, and with its relatively fast acceleration, the car keeps up nicely with most other cars. Getting 6 gears too allows players to drive in the power band everywhere, making the Sunrise's cornering very fast. Its agility leaves a little bit to be desired, but it isn't snappy like the Raiden is, for example. Overall, I'd put it here in the triangle, and with it I set a 1 minute and 10.577 despite nearly crashing. Well, this is the one you've probably been waiting for me to talk about, Super Venom. Going from 0 to 60 in 4.1 seconds, Super Venom is the epitome of power, making 201 brake horsepower and 401 Nm of torque. It weighs in at 1,560 kilos. Where to start with the Super Venom? Well, it's a bit of a handful to drive in every class, oversteering literally everywhere without exception. This makes it, while hard, extremely fun to drive around. Its power band is the same as the Venom's, and if the Roadslayer GT would have the same engine as the Roadslayer, it would probably be comparable to this, maybe even better. Super Venom is the fastest car in the game, so what's its problems? Well, it does have some. Let's start with it having no grip to speak of. Combined with very wide wheel arches, makes this car trivial to spin out. In higher classes, it's also very capable of spinning out under its own power through corners, and the front comes down quite slowly under power, kind of like a wheelie that it can't maintain. But once you tame this car, it's like no other. Straights become pretty much non-existent, meaning you need to learn how it corners very quickly, or it will spin out. Overall, I put it here on the triangle, and with it I set a 1 minute and 8.342. Sweeper is quite a change of pace to the Super Venom. Going from 0 to 60 in 4.49 seconds, it makes 275 brake horsepower and 517 Nm of torque. Weighing in at 1,672 kilos, Sweeper isn't especially fast as cars go, but you'll notice here I run it fairly well armoured. This car doesn't really get slower with armour on. Its handling is sort of loose and vague to begin with, swinging wide in most turns, with and without armour. But it's a tough cookie. I'm not sure I've ever damaged the gearbox in this car, or lost a wheel for that matter. It's really strong. Not invincible, granted, but for how small it is, Sweeper packs a punch in a fight. Its relatively good acceleration from the torquey engine allows you to get away from a well-timed corner bomb as well. Overall, I put it here on the triangle, and with it I set a 1 minute and 10.430. Considering I'm running as much armour on as I am, it's actually really good. This car is part of the Banger Racing car pack. Tristar is the second car players typically drive in Wreckfest. Going from 0 to 60 in 4.58 seconds, it weighs in at 1,050 kilos, makes 175 brake horsepower and 195 Nm of torque. Tristar has 5 gears, but 5th gear is overdrive. You may remember this from earlier. Overdrive is an extremely long last gear, basically. Now, combining this with very short gears that you get in the tuning options, regardless of tuning, makes it very annoying to drive in any other class aside from C class, and its overdrive gear makes it very annoying to drive in C class. Tristar's good handling is a very redeeming feature though, as it feels very planted through every turn and rarely understeers or oversteers excessively. Tristar is very weak in terms of HP loss, but I find its parts are stronger than average. Overall, I'd put it here on the triangle, and with it I set a 1 minute and 10.473. Trooper is quite a mediocre car. Going from 0 to 60 in 4.41 seconds, it makes 220 brake horsepower and 403 Nm of torque. Weighing in at 1,336 kilos, Trooper is perfectly described by understeer. Even when you try to make the Trooper step out, it will continue to understeer. If you completely unlock the diff, it will understeer. Hell, if you aren't even steering, it'll understeer. Okay, well, maybe not, but I think you get the idea. Trooper's handling is terrible. Combined with its very low revving engine and 4-wheel drive means that it bogs down if you handbrake turn it sideways. Frankly, with how tall it is though, I'm surprised it doesn't fall over. There isn't really a redeeming feature to this car. Maybe if it fell over there would be, because at least it would be funny. Well, aside from having slightly above average acceleration. Overall, I put it here on the triangle, and with it I set a surprisingly good 1 minute and 10.801. We're still half a second off pace from like average cars, but frankly I'll take it. Like I said, every car in the off-road car pack needs a buff, and this one's certainly no exception. I want a trophy truck. We have trophy truck at home. The trophy truck at home. Going from 0 to 60 in 4.17 seconds, Trophy Runner makes 268 brake horsepower and 421 Nm of torque, weighing in at 1,630 kilos. I'm kind of undecided on what to think of this car. On the one hand, it has got some top 100 lap times, thanks to its suspension being set up how it is. On the other hand, it's anything other than what a trophy truck should handle like. It's truly just a Toyota Tacoma with a lift kit on it. If the suspension sagged about half of its travel on its hardest settings so the tyres would remain in constant contact with the ground almost everywhere, taking up bumps, rumble strip and, well, whatever with ease where normal cars might be thrown around a little, and remaining its power, it might be a bit more balanced. About half the compression and suspension pressure comes to mind. But aside from a few cheesy cuts on 2 or 3 tracks, this truck really has no place in Wreckfest. I know in C-Class it makes about half the power of a real trophy truck, but it should shift under power. I think that would make the handling quite difficult for players to get used to, so that's why the devs didn't implement it, but overall I put it here on the triangle, and with it I set a 1 minute 11.254. Vandal. Going from 0 to 60 in 4.3 seconds, it makes 401 brake horsepower and 750 Nm of torque. That's not an error, it makes 750 Nm of torque. Weighing in at 2,441 kilos, it kinda needs to. It's the second heaviest vehicle in the game, and it's, well, probably the slowest car in the game, or van, I suppose. This is the best lap I could set in the Vandal. I could have done with braking about a car's length earlier everywhere, but you don't really drive the Vandals to go quickly, so discussing lap times isn't really worth it. This car isn't very great for its size, its acceleration is brilliant, and even unarmoured, this is a bit of a beast. The Vandal understeers horrendously everywhere, which makes corner bombing fairly good, because even if you don't fully commit to a corner bomb, you're always going to end up pushing people wide into walls. The handbrake rotates the vehicle very predictably, making cornering actually quite easy so long as you're not trying to hot lap like I was here. I'm sure with more than 2 laps of practice I could have set a far better time than a 1 minute 14.454. I've seen people do better, but overall I put this car here on the triangle. Vandal is part of the Rusty Rats car pack. Venom is the last unlockable car in the game, and actually my favourite car in the game. Going from 0 to 60 in 4.28 seconds, Venom makes 272 brake horsepower and 425 Nm of torque. Weighing in at 1,650 kilos, Venom is arguably top 5 currently in the game. Whenever you run into someone driving this car, you know they have a bit of experience and understanding in the game. You need to complete Twisted Chaos, one of the last career events in World Masters, in order to unlock this car, so you have to play a bit to unlock it. In terms of handling, this car is kind of like a tamed Super Venom. Funny, that. Being fairly strong, but taking engine and gearbox damage quite easily, it's good literally everywhere. It'll out-accelerate pretty much every car in the game, short of like Raiden and Super Venom. Combined with its good cornering ability, it's only really let down by understeer in C-Class if you get caught out of the power band mid-corner, but a simple clutch kit can solve that most of, if not all the time. Thankfully this doesn't have the wide arches of the Super Venom, which actually makes it really narrow for its size and weight. This gives it very good high speed characteristics, and overall I put it here on the triangle, and with it I set a 1 minute and 9.281. Warwagon is my go-to fighting car, going from 0 to 60 in 4.44 seconds and weighing in at 2,089 kilos with my armour on. It makes 343 brake horsepower and 498 Nm of torque. Warwagon is the ideal combination of strength and speed in my opinion, allowing for fairly competitive lap times like a fairly easy 54 on Hill Street for example, but its only real disadvantage is its sluggish suspension. Now, thanks to its very long power band, the Warwagon struggles to slow down mid-corner, and it also finds speeding up very easy mid-corner. This is a genuinely good thing, because it allows you to get out of the way of incoming corner bombs very easily, but also because it's a fairly rare and useful characteristic of the car. That sluggish suspension manifests its worst side when it comes to leaning side by side with players. Any car equal to its weight will win no problem, and even some under. I've seen Roadslayers beat me without armour on. But it's not like you can't just back out of it and let them spin themselves on you, and if they don't, well, it's fast enough to keep up. Overall I put it here on the triangle, and despite all that armour I set a 1 minute 10.463. Wildking is secretly an up-armoured rocket. Going from 0 to 60 in 4.8 seconds, it makes 290 brake horsepower and 480 Nm of torque. Weighing in at 1,760 kilos, there isn't really much in the way of downsides to this car. Its acceleration off the line is pretty poor, but this is only because of its very short second gear. The power band's a little tight, but that's not really an issue because the engine is so torquey. For the car's weight, it'll just pull through anything. And even with that tight power band being relatively low in the revs, it doesn't drop off at the higher end. This is another fairly stout fighting car, but it's a little less tough than the aforementioned Warwagon. Sadly, Wildking takes wheel damage very easily, I've noticed. In fact, I don't know of another car that I've lost rear wheels in, but granted, it survived the encounter, and while obviously losing a wheel is catastrophic, it remains surprisingly competitive. I survived and I didn't come last, so it can't be terrible. Overall, I put it here on the triangle, and with it I set a 1 minute and 10.228. That really speaks to how competitive it is. Wildking is part of the American All-Stars car pack. Wingman. Going from 0 to 60 in 4.7 seconds, Wingman weighs in at 2,376 kilos, makes 392 brake horsepower and 717 Nm of torque. This is actually a bit of a secret gem in Wreckfest. Heavily underrated for being sluggish and easy to spin, Wingman's actually a beast of a fighting car in capable hands. With a very long rear end, it's extremely easy to spin out, but without armour, this car is as tough and as manoeuvrable as the Warwagon. With a bit of armour on, it only understeers a little bit more and gets far tougher to fight against. In terms of fighting, Wingman's kind of like a Grand Duke, but faster in a straight line and a lot more willing to understeer. Entering corners though, I kind of find that this begins to oversteer a lot. It's really strange, I can't really describe it to you, but you can see how I'm fighting with the car quite a bit. Overall I put it here on the triangle, and with it I set a 1 minute and 12.913. Wingman is part of the Retro Rammers car pack. Apologies for this video taking quite a bit longer than I expected. It's really quite hard to come up with something different to talk about for a minute with every single car in the game. There's something like 80, and, well, have all of them sound different. All that being said, next week I'll be uploading either an epic race I had, or finishing part 3 of Slayer of Midgets' Racing Academy. Probably the former, seeing as Wreckfest's just gone on sale. Maybe I can get a few extra players into the game. So, I'll see you there. Thank you for watching.